So it's easy to forget that terrorism is still a major threat around the world and at home here in the United States. I mean, the FBI just announced that 640 terror plots were disrupted in the United States in 2025 alone. On top of that, we're seeing the Islamic State on the march across Africa. Al-Qaeda is again firmly entrenched in Afghanistan, and with the ongoing war in Iran, there's an increased risk of Iranian-backed attacks at home or abroad. So it's pretty notable when the new counterterrorism strategy comes out and is found, well, lacking. Today we're joined by Dr. Colin Clarke to dig into this new document and what it means for the ongoing fight against terrorism. Colin is the executive director of the Soufan Center, where his research focuses on domestic and transnational terrorism, international security, and geopolitics. Colin just co-authored a piece on this very subject in Foreign Policy with his colleague Clara Brokart. That, along with everywhere you can follow Colin, will be linked in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Colin, thank you so much for taking the time, sir. This is a hot issue, so I'm looking forward to getting into this with you.
Thanks for having me on.
So I know you're not a big fan of the new counterterrorism strategy. I've seen that. It's out there in the public domain, but I think the best place to start would be, like, does it even matter? Or is this just another government document that, like, a few people look at and debate around and then we move on?
That's a legitimate question, right? Like, I would make the argument that, these 16 pages right here are going to determine everything we do in counterterrorism. And I don't want to be unduly harsh either. If I thought this was a great document, I'd have no problem coming out and saying so. It prompted me to go back and read previous documents. There was two under the Bush administration. I think it was 2003, updated in 2006. Obama put one out in 2011. There was another one in 2018, Trump 1 administration. And then there was a domestic terrorism strategy in 2021. Those were all fundamentally different in nature. None of those were partisan documents, which this is. I think maybe that's part of what triggered me. As a nonpartisan person, I don't belong to either political party. So to see such an emphasis in a government document making politics an issue, when I've long warned about politicizing counterterrorism, it shouldn't be a politicized issue. We should care about all forms of terrorism across the ideological spectrum, from left to right, everything in between, jihadists, anyone that wants to harm Americans, we should care about, right? It shouldn't just be certain groups. So it doesn't meet the mark for me in that regard. And to your question of does it matter? I've had this conversation with folks over the last week. I think it's symbolic. It shows that there's a sense of urgency. It shows that the people that are running point on this issue in the administration know what they're talking about and can be trusted to carry out a mission that, while it's not, at the forefront of our minds anymore, we're coming up in September on the 25-year anniversary of 9/11. We've put the GWOT, the Global War on Terrorism, in our rearview mirror. In some ways, that's good. But I think we've totally pivoted hard away from counterterrorism, almost making it an afterthought or a back burner issue. And as someone that focuses solely on CT at times and through my little narrow soda straw, that's concerning to me. And we also know that it only takes one terrorist attack to totally upend an administration's foreign policy. The last thing I'll say is it comes at a time of heightened urgency for me because we're at war with the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. So it actually is completely relevant. When you are at war with a country like Iran, it changes the terrorism threat landscape dynamics. And this document fails to address that.
It's always I feel like everything political these days, that tough line of how much time you spend digging into it and explaining, like, this is a really big deal versus, the next day there's also going to be a big deal thing. So it's tempting to let stuff go. And I appreciate your kind of digging in on this. Since I didn't realize it's not like the NSS, the National Security Strategy. It's not like the National Defense Strategy that have somewhat of a schedule. This seems a little more at random when it's coming out. Is there any sense as to why this one came out now?
I'd like to chalk it up to the public pressure campaign I've been.
There was one. I saw that. Yeah.
On social media for the last 2 months. But no, I mean, look, the reason I started kind of putting out those tweets relentlessly was because the senior director for counterterrorism, Sebastian Gorka, promised us last year, I think it was in June or July, in a series of think tank speeches, that the strategy was imminent. And so, to me, imminent, maybe a month or two. Sometimes when I tell my wife I'm going to do something imminently, we disagree over how imminent that is. But imminent doesn't mean to me almost a full year. And I think there was reports maybe 2 or 3 months ago from Reuters that the White House is in the process of organizing a global summit on Antifa. And I just thought to myself, well, if they're busy doing that, where's the strategy? Have we agreed that Antifa is a threat? If we even agree that it's a threat, is it a top 3 threat? Should we be holding a global summit on it, or is that politically motivated? And I think it's the latter.
Can you get into what's different with this one than previous strategies?
Yeah, sure. So for starters, it's riddled with partisan comments. Even after claiming, on page 4, our counterterrorism operations will be executed apolitically. We won't permit the weaponization of America's unparalleled CT capabilities for partisan purposes. And then the next sentence starts attacking the Biden administration. Joe Biden's name appears 7 times in this document. Lebanese Hezbollah appears twice. The word drone appears twice. So are you telling me that, let's use Hezbollah for example? We know that Hezbollah is using FPV drones now, right? So is Joe Biden more of a threat and more of a concern than Hezbollah using drones? Shortly after the Iran war kicked off, I wrote an article for The Atlantic where I talked about the threat of Iranian sleeper cells in this country, which is a very real threat. There was an FBI memo that resurfaced talking about the threat of non-state actors using drones off the west coast of our country. So these are real issues. When a reporter recently asked, the senior director for counterterrorism, whether war with Iran increases the chances of Iranian-backed terrorism on U.S. soil, he responded by saying, anyone that thinks that is testicularly challenged. Well, I can tell you right now, I'm not testicularly challenged, and I think that. It's not a low-T approach. In fact, it's common sense, and dismissing such a question just shows, a lack of concern for how serious this issue is. Again, let me repeat, we are at war, an active war with the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. We know they've launched attacks around the world, in Argentina, in Bulgaria, in Saudi Arabia. They have transnational capabilities. We've arrested Hezbollah operatives casing landmarks on U.S. soil. So why is that not a fair question? There's just way too much cheerleading, Preston, that comes across in this. It's way too much about the president and not about what the mission is, what the resources are, how those resources are actually tied to achieving our objectives. And frankly, I don't think it adequately describes the threat environment in a way that prior documents have.
The low T comment was wild. I had to go back a couple times and make sure that wasn't like taken out of context or just made up. Is kind of what I thought it was right out of the gate. But what's interesting with that one and the limited amount of attention on Hezbollah is, I know this is a long time ago, so folks won't remember, but before we went into Venezuela, one of the arguments being made there was their connections to Hezbollah and connections to Iran. And people were like, well, I mean, there's a little bit there, but I don't know that justifies a war. It feels like we very quickly moved on from that to where Hezbollah is not the threat that it was just a few months ago.
Yeah, and look, the Israelis have weakened Hezbollah significantly, but the group continues to fight. It's firmly entrenched in Lebanon. It has a transnational network that stretches from Latin America to West Africa to Southeast Asia. And this is a group that has a long memory as well. So just dismissing it and saying, if you don't, there's a difference between asking analytical questions, which is what the intelligence community does. By the way, the intelligence community is impugned in this report. So, the very people that you're talking about helping you find, fix, and finish are the same ones that you're assailing and denigrating in this report, which I also find inappropriate, frankly, and politically motivated. So anybody that's not cheering for and drinking the Kool-Aid on how this war with Iran is going is dismissed by the current administration. And, I know this is a podcast about the counterterrorism strategy and not about the war with Iran, but it's hard to talk about those two in tandem and not see the connection there. And frankly, the war in Iran's not going well. I think that's apparent to anyone that's watching closely.
I was surprised that there wasn't more focus on the Shia terrorism. That was, coming out to New York a couple of years ago. That was kind of the focus at the Soufan event. I was surprised. It was just, I feel like my entire life it's been Sunni focused, Al Qaeda and Islamic State, and all of a sudden there was this shift, especially post October 7th. We're like, hey, wait a minute, we really need to reevaluate. Do you see that trend here at all? Is it downplayed? Is it glossed over?
It's just really not explored in the depth that you would want to see in a policy document and a strategy document. It's name checked and it's kind of implied in some ways, but there's really little recognition, and there's also little direction on what to do. There's a lot of boilerplate language in here, but again, like that was true of previous strategies, so I want to be fair. But when you look at the goals of the counterterrorism strategy, there's three that are listed: identify terror actors and plots before they happen, cut off their arms, funding, and recruiting streams, destroy established threat groups. I mean, that's kind of like a chat GPT spit out of counterterrorism 101. No, I mean, I'm not trying to make light of it, but there's no description of the operational environment in which these groups operate. I wrote a piece shortly after the Iran war broke out with my colleague, Clara Brokart, in foreign policy, where we talked about the potential for just what you asked about, which is this wave of Shia extremism on the back end of this war, particularly if these groups are battered, right? And there's kind of this disrupted command and control, and you start seeing these kind of almost like little shards of glass all over the region. You've got Lebanese Hezbollah, you have the Houthis in Yemen, you have Shia militia groups, in Iraq. You have Afghan and Pakistani Shia groups that the Iranians have turned into a foreign fighter network that could be unleashed in South Asia. So, there's multiple tentacles here at play, and the Iranians are, the IRGC is still in control. In fact, many would argue, and many have argued, that it's a more hardline regime that's in control of the country at the moment, and probably less less encumbered and more likely to use the proxies that they've cultivated over these years.
Does this mean though? So when looking at the operators, the people actually out there doing their best to prevent terrorist attacks, say there's the Al Qaeda desk, very vaguely at CIA. Does this kind of thing mean that they're shifting their focus and they're like pulling people off that desk to instead go after anarchists and anti-fascists? Or is there a lot of room between this policy statement and that type of change at that level?
Look, I just the report on page 5 says currently we face three major types of terror groups. Legacy Islamist terrorism is who you're just referencing. You're talking about Al Qaeda, Sunni jihadist groups, but there's a whole world in that legacy Islamist terrorist groups. There's all of the Al Qaeda groups, the affiliates and branches, and the Islamic State as well, and they're all over the world. So there's ISIS-K, there's Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, there's Al-Shabaab, there's Jainim in the Sahel, right? There's so many packed into that one kind of heading. It doesn't list Shia groups at all as one of the three major types of terror groups. So it's unclear to me, what kind of resources are allocated to that threat. We're now treating narco-terrorists and transnational gangs as FTOs. They've been designated as FTOs. I've written and spoken publicly about why I think that's not a good idea. I've now accepted that that's the case, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now? How do we make sure that our focus on going after those groups doesn't, is it robbing Peter to pay Paul, where we're taking resources, finite resources, which have already been dwindling post GWAT, right? Like I've made the argument that the cupboard's already quite bare when it comes to CT. Now, what little we have left, we're dedicating to marginal issues. I mean, look, we can talk about violent left-wing extremists too. It's not a binary. It's not they are a threat or they aren't. And it's not a political statement either. I think left-wing extremism is a big deal. I think it is on the rise. But to also completely omit the threat from far right comes across as politically motivated. I'm talking to you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we had the Tree of Life synagogue attack. We've seen far-right attacks perpetrated in El Paso, Texas, in Buffalo, New York. We know that there are well-armed white supremacists and neo-Nazis that are also anti-government in nature. They get no mention in this entire document. They're completely omitted. So what are we to think then of a career CT professional that leaves out an entire category of threat actor?
Well, an interesting thing there is not just that it's left out, because like I feel like I could debate whether or not Shia extremism is left out or not, because it says legacy Islamist terrorists. I'm like, maybe kind of group them in there, but they specifically call out violent left-wing extremists.
Yeah.
Just say violent extremists.
Yeah.
I feel like if we're going to go, let's go broad, group everyone in there.
Yeah, I mean, there's again a number of issues that just come across to me as not necessarily the level of professionalism I would have expected from this type of office. It talks about our CT powers will not be used to target our fellow Americans who simply disagree with us. Timothy McVeigh simply disagreed with the U.S. government. Are those folks not worthy of countering homegrown violent extremists and domestic terrorists, right? What about the militias that are present on our soil that constantly make threats against the U.S. government? Do they deserve any attention here whatsoever? So I just think, again, and we can go into other categories too. Nihilistic violent extremism, NVE, which the FBI now recognizes as a major threat, totally not mentioned here. Technophobes or neo-Luddites. These are folks that are committing violent acts because they are angered by the ubiquity of technology, artificial intelligence, 5G cell towers. We've seen a number of attacks along those lines, incels, so on and so forth. So, I guess my overarching critique would be that we live in a world where the terrorist threat landscape is incredibly complex. This strategy makes it seem anything but. I could go back to an article I wrote with Bruce Hoffman several years ago where we call the terrorism threat kaleidoscopic in nature, right? It's much different than the fairly monolithic threat posed by Sunni jihadists for 20 years. We're in a different echelon now, and we see threats all across the board. But this is just too overly simplified to me to have any real impact.
I see that anti-fascist or Antifa is included here, and we've chatted previously about that. There was a spike of a period of time where it was like, I think there were folks talking about how they were more dangerous than Hezbollah, but it seems like that faded a little bit. Has it?
Well, former DHS Secretary Kristi Noem said that Antifa was just as dangerous as ISIS, Hezbollah, or MS-13, I think it was. And I just don't think I've ever met a serious counterterrorism analyst that would agree with that. Again, I don't want to discount violence we've seen from the left. We can get into, Dan Byman has a good article, I think, in Lawfare about coding terrorism, right? After a plot or an attack, how do we determine motive and what, drove these people, especially when there's multiple factors, right? That's also led to a category that former FBI Director Chris Wray has called salad bar terrorism, right? It's not a coherent ideology. It's a little bit from the left. It's a little bit from the right.
I feel like that's what we're seeing a lot of.
It's some internet memes sprinkled in, right? Doing it for the lulz. There's all these different aspects. And then there's kind of like non-traditional ideologies that we're only starting to recognize now. Think about eco-fascists, right? Which have been described as white supremacists going green, right? They're white supremacists and they want to protect the environment because they want to protect it for a white ethno-state. So, they're concerned about preserving things for white people, and the cause of all these ills are immigrants. So it's a very complex landscape. If you don't spend a lot of time online, a lot of these things might not be clear to you. But in a country where, people can access sophisticated weaponry, and we do have violent extremists, frequently engaging in attacks, that's something to know about. I'd also say we had 4 terrorist attacks in the month of March, right? So what prompted the release of the strategy? I wonder if that might have been a cause. We had an attack in Austin, Texas that was Iranian inspired. We had another attack in Michigan because an individual there, his brother was in Hezbollah and was killed, a family member. And so he drove a truck into a synagogue and tried to blow it up. That could have been far worse, actually, than it was. We had an ISIS-inspired attack in New York City, where 2 individuals drove from Bucks County, Pennsylvania to New York and attempted to throw an improvised explosive device at a rally. And we also had a former ISIS member, or someone that pleaded guilty and served time in prison for material support to ISIS, coming out and trying to kill ROTC members at Old Dominion University. So that's 4 terrorist attacks right there in the month of March. 2 Iranian inspired and 2 ISIS inspired. And look, I think we're, if you look in the news, there's plots on a regular basis across the world that remain jihadist inspired attacks. I think that's one of the things that the strategy gets right, the continued focus on jihadism, because that, it ebbs and flows, but it hasn't gone away. I think the report gets right the focus on WMD, right? These worst case scenarios and preventing that from happening. But there's a lot of other areas that I really would have liked to see more, including a strategy that engaged more with terrorists' use of emerging technologies, including drones and including artificial intelligence.
I like that. But I feel like we're in this tough spot where we want it to both be very specific at times, but also relatively broad at times. Where do you draw that line between, you just rattled off like 17 different types of terrorists that I've never even heard of. How far down that rabbit hole do you go listing those versus just like top 3 type scenario?
I like to be comprehensive, right? And I think a strategy should be comprehensive. And I'll give you an example why. Before October 7th, 2023, I can tell you, I live in the counterterrorism world. Nobody outside of maybe a handful of folks I know in Israel were talking about Hamas. It was a back burner issue. No one cared. We had hardly anyone in this country focusing on it or working on it. And then October 7th happened, right? So it doesn't really matter how prominent a terrorist group is at the time. We have to be concerned about all of them. Anyone that wants to harm Americans, anyone that wants to harm our allies, because you can have a Hamas that's been, quasi dormant or flying below the radar, and all of a sudden, launches an attack like we saw on October 7th, 2023. How many other groups are like that are out there that we're kind of, putting on the side that have the capability and the intent to harm us? It's not always the most vocal groups, right? It's not always the ISIS-K. It's not always AQAP, the groups that are constantly flooding you with propaganda and threatening you. Sometimes it's other groups. So for my money, I'd rather be comprehensive and kind of show that I'm aware of all of these, various threat vectors and attack surface, and then talk through ways that I'm connecting resources to objectives, right? And not just kind of a very descriptive, kind of seemingly rushed overview of the several threats that are my pet rocks that I care about, that maybe I have to care about because of my politics or the people's politics who I'm working with.
I know a gripe in the CT community has been funding and focus for a while. We're over a year now into this administration. What does that look like? Has it increased, decreased, about the same? Is it as expected?
It's hard to say. And I think, we're still dealing with the effects of the DOGE cuts, both in terms of people that actually lost their jobs that were in government. And I know some people within State Department counterterrorism, people that have, seen the writing on the wall and chosen to retire or maybe move on. The shift in folks from counterterrorism to other administration priorities like immigration enforcement. Let's just go back to the Old Dominion example for a second. Again, this was an individual that pled guilty to material support to ISIS, that went, served time, got out of prison, got a gun, and then went and went to go shoot and kill ROTC members. So we're busy hunting down day laborers in the parking lot of Home Depot, but we're letting an convicted ISIS terrorist roam around and shoot
Yeah,
people.
dropped a few balls on that one.
That doesn't square with me, right? And so, there's examples like that make me concerned that we're not focused. In terms of funding, this is dovetails with another one of my critiques of the strategy. We kneecapped USAID, right? This strategy is almost completely kinetic. It says nothing about the structural conditions or the drivers that lead to recruitment and radicalization. Now, if you pull the rug out from partner nations in Africa that struggle with, poor governance and porous borders and building partner capacity, you end up with what we see in the Sahel, which is not just a failed state, but what I would argue is a failed region. And we have yet another terrorist group that is on the verge of being in charge of a state. We saw it in Afghanistan. We saw it in Syria. Now we're looking at it in Mali.
It's everywhere. It's happening nonstop. All right, so if next year, say we're going to do this again, new counterterrorism strategy coming out, White House calls, says, Dr. Colin Clarke, sir, will you please lead the counterterrorism strategy? What are you doing differently?
I am talking to the Counterterrorism Brain Trust, not only in government, but outside of government. I'm calling Brian Jenkins and Bruce Hoffman and Audrey Kurth Cronin and Martha Crenshaw. And I'm humble enough to know that I don't know everything, but there are folks that have been doing this for 4 or 5 decades that have a little bit of perspective and do. In the ProPublica article that Hannah Alam wrote a few weeks ago describing the missing CT strategy, there was a comment that someone made off the record. It was essentially Gorka bragging that he wasn't consulting the interagency, right? Which is not traditional. I'd say it shows in this that the interagency wasn't consulted, but what's the harm in saying, hey, DIA, what's your take on this? Hey, State Department, what do you guys think about this? Hey, what do the Iran experts think the potential is for the Iranians to commit or conduct a terrorist attack against the U.S. at home, or maybe a U.S. embassy abroad? What's the harm in that? I mean, it took an extra year after the document was imminent to get put out, so it wasn't a timing thing. And the fact that there's so little on Iran here makes it look like it was rushed and slapped together and pushed out. So I would be more deliberate. If I had a full year to write this, frankly, I think I could do it in a month probably. I would be humble in knowing what I don't know. And I would say, hey, who's the top person on, cyber terrorism? Who's the leading authority on issue X? Then I would go and talk to them and see what they had to say. That's just good due diligence.
It's also a good way to build a team, right? Get everybody's get to say like, hey, this is so and so. They helped contribute to the national counterterrorism strategy. That's huge, man. People would they live on that for years. So of course, reach out to anyone you can.
Look, and let me caveat that by saying President Obama was often assailed for paralysis by analysis, right? Overthinking things. And I think there's, that's a legitimate criticism. I think sometimes, and I've made light of it myself. You read a 200-page report or book, and then at the end there's a, bullet point policy recommendations, and they say, whole of government approach. Like, okay, yeah, no shit. Like, of course, whole of government approach. But actually, how do you operationalize that? How do you get other agencies that have expertise and skin in the game to buy into your mission and strategy? And a lot of times it's the same thing with writing a book or writing a paper. You send it out to reviewers, and 9 times out of 10, it strengthens what you're working on, because there's people out there that are thinking about things that you haven't, that are questioning kind of maybe some of your prior assumptions, that are poking at your hypotheses. And that's not criticism. That's just, again, that's sound research. That's a process. I don't know what the process was here, but the end result's not great. It's subpar.
It's crazy that like this was the time, because we still to talk about Iranian-backed terrorism, and we're hearing that all the time. Like in the middle of these negotiations, we're hearing the #1 state sponsor of terror, and like it's just constantly brought up. It feels like if there was a time to highlight that and have section after section after section talking about it, even if the answer is they're degraded and they're not going to be able to do what they could, it feels like that should have been a very large area of this. It's kind of shocking that it's not.
When I printed the document out and stapled it together, I had to go back to my printer because I thought a couple of the pages might have fallen onto the floor. No,
It
I'm
ate
not
the
even
Iran
kidding.
section.
I'm not even being facetious. I think the other thing, again, this prompted me to go back and reread prior strategies. And it's really interesting if you take this and read it next to the 2018 counterterrorism strategy, because that's also Trump. That's Trump 1. And there's an entire section dedicated to recruitment and radicalization. There's an entire section dedicated to strengthening the capabilities of our allies. Allies here are dismissed. They're in the Europe section on page 12. A paragraph starts, Europe must significantly increase its CT efforts immediately. That sounds like a kid being scolded. And I think it's actually reflective of the way that we've treated our allies throughout Trump 2.0, how we've browbeaten them and harangued them over NATO. Again, not all of which is bad. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be expecting more from our allies, but I think it's the way you go about it. Is this having the desired effect? Are allies hopping on the phone and being like, yes, sir, we will increase our CT's, capabilities significantly ASAP? No, it's about a partnership. It's about showing respect for what your allies bring to the table. And I think not dismissing them wholesale. We've done a lot of great things with our allies in the CT space. And to me, the transition from 20 years of the global war on terrorism to great power competition, that's the part that I want to kind of salvage, is those relationships that we've built with Five Eyes, with Five Eyes Plus. Look at something like Operation Gallant Phoenix, right? And the way we came together with the coalition to defeat Daesh. I think it was an 80+ member coalition. We brought everybody on board because the threat was so critical, and it worked well. I was I traveled all over the world during the peak of the caliphate to meetings with the Global Counterterrorism Forum, where we talked about how do we prevent foreign fighters from leaving Europe and ending up in the caliphate, right? And it's about sharing our resources, our world-class intelligence capabilities, including signals intelligence, with our allies to kind of help augment what they're able to do. There was a time, 10 years ago, where we were dealing with vehicle rammings on a fairly regular basis. Nice, Stockholm, Berlin, New York City, right? This was ISIS-inspired terrorism. We brought together the best minds to think through, what are the components of homegrown violent extremism, digital radicalization, all these different ways that ISIS is seeking to inspire people in the West to murder our civilians. It takes a lot of brain power. It takes a lot of, not just policymakers, but it takes practitioners. And I remember being at these conferences. There was a conference we did on protecting soft targets from attack in 2017 in Brussels. And the first speaker was from Marriott. And I'm like, oh yeah, the Marriott was attacked in Islamabad and Jakarta, right? Hotels are frequently attacked. Bring them to the table. So I think, just a more well-rounded approach to this, a little bit more humility would go a long way, and reaching out to allies rather than kind of, browbeating them would, I think, go a long way toward at least strengthening some of these capabilities. Look, we're never going to be perfect. We're never going to stop every attack, but we sure as hell want it to be as close to zero as possible.
Well, Colin, appreciate your public campaign to get this thing out there, because without that, we would have nothing to go off of now. We'd be just guessing what the counterterrorism strategy is. So appreciate you beating that drum and following up and actually adding the critiques and what you would suggest. It's really valuable. So appreciate the time, sir.
Thanks for having me on to speak about this. It's an issue that I care deeply about, not just as an analyst, but as an American citizen.
All right, so thank you so much to Colin for taking the time to walk through all of that. Again, all of these source documents and more material from Colin will be linked in the description. We've got the original counterterrorism strategy, the one that we're talking about and dissecting in this video. We've got his piece in foreign policy, and I believe there's one more article coming out here in the next couple days. We'll add that to the description as well. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.